I want to tell you about the moment I understood exactly what kind of man my son had become. It was not the moment he said what he said. It was the moment after. The moment when I nodded slowly and told him I would think about it and watched his shoulders drop with the particular relief of a man who believes he has planted a seed that is already halfway to a harvest. That moment. Right there. The relief on his face while his mother's casket was still in the ground behind him and the roses the funeral home had arranged were still shaking slightly in the October wind. That is the moment I understood. And if you are new here, I need you to understand something before this story goes any further. I'm not a man who makes decisions quickly. I never have been. I spent 38 years as a commercial real estate appraiser in this state, and the single most important thing that profession teaches you, the thing that separates the people who last from the people who burn out or get it wrong, is this: never make an assessment based on what something looks like today. Always look at what it was built on. My name is Wallace Greer. I am 71 years old. I live on 14 acres in a house my wife Nora and I built in 1991 from a set of plans we had drawn up by an architect friend who charged us less than he should have because he said people with this much intention about a house deserved a discount. And what my son said to me at Nora's funeral, on the day we buried the woman who had been every good thing about my life for 44 years, is the thing that set into motion the most deliberate and consequential 11 months I have ever spent. Welcome to Dad's retribution. Get comfortable. Because this story starts with a funeral and ends with a folder that my son still has not fully recovered from opening. And before we go any further, if you are new here, subscribe right now and hit that bell. Because the stories on this channel do not end the way anyone expects. And you do not want to miss what is in that folder. Let me tell you about Nora first. Because this story is impossible to understand without her. Nora Jean Greer, born Nora Jean Calloway in Harlan County, Kentucky in 1953, was a woman who operated on a frequency that most people spent their whole lives trying to locate and never quite found. She was a landscape architect by training and a gardener by compulsion, and the 14 acres we lived on were, by the time she was done with them, something that people drove past slowly and occasionally stopped to ask about. She had a greenhouse she had built herself in 1998 from salvaged glass and reclaimed timber that she had sourced from a barn demolition outside of town. She grew things in that greenhouse that had no business growing in our climate. She had a notebook system for her plantings that was so precise and cross-referenced that after she died I spent 3 hours just trying to understand the indexing before I gave up and called her friend Margot, who told me, with great affection, that the system was designed to be understood only by Nora. Nora was also, and I want to be clear about this because it matters to everything that follows, the person who first told me something was wrong. Not with her health. That came later. With our son Vincent. It was a Sunday afternoon in January of 2022. We were in the kitchen. She was repotting something from the greenhouse that had outgrown its container, and I was reading. The Sunday afternoon quiet that we had lived inside comfortably for 40 years. She said without looking up from the pot, "Wallace, I need to talk to you about Vincent." I put the paper down. She said, "I think he is waiting for something." I said, "What do you mean?" She set the pot down carefully and looked at me with the particular steadiness she had when she was about to say something she had been considering for a long time. She said, "I mean that when he calls, he asks about the property more than he asks about us. I mean that when he visits, he walks the land in a way that is less like a son who loves where he grew up and more like someone who is calculating. I mean that his wife Constance talks about the house the way you talk about something you are about to inherit." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "He's our son, Nora." She said, "I know that, Wallace. That is precisely why I am telling you instead of ignoring it." She picked up the pot and went back to what she was doing. I picked up the paper. But I did not read another word of it. I filed what she had said. The way I had always filed things. Carefully. In the back of my mind, where assessments go when there is not yet enough data to act on them, but there is enough to know that the data is coming. Nora was diagnosed in the spring of 2022. Pancreatic cancer. The kind that does not ask permission and does not negotiate timeline. Her oncologist was a compassionate and honest man named Dr. Reyes, who told us what we needed to know without decoration. We had months, not years. The quality of those months was something we could influence. The quantity was not. I want to tell you about those months because they are the foundation of everything that came after. Nora was not afraid. That is the thing I most need you to understand about her. She was not afraid. She was organized and she was present, and she was, in the way she had been about everything in her life, absolutely clear about what mattered and what did not. She spent a significant portion of those months in the greenhouse. She spent them with her notebooks. She spent them with Margot, who drove out from town 3 times a week and sat with her in the way that old friends sit, mostly in comfortable silence. She spent them with me, on the back porch in the evenings watching the light change across the land we had built our life on. She spent very little of them with Vincent. He called. He visited twice. Both visits were brief and both times Constance was with him, and both times, in my observation, the visits had a quality of obligation rather than love. The quality of someone checking a box, noting a data point, returning home with updated information. On one of those visits, the second one, in late August when Nora was in the greenhouse and Vincent and I were on the porch, he said to me very casually, "Dad, have you two thought at all about what comes next? For the property, I mean. It's a lot of land to manage, especially as things progress." As things progress. I looked at my son. 44 years old. His mother was 30 feet away in a greenhouse she had built with her own hands, fighting a cancer that was going to win, and he was on my porch using the phrase "as things progress." I said, "We take things one day at a time, Vincent." He nodded. He said, Of course. Of course. I just want to make sure you're thinking about it. So there's a plan." I said, "There's always been a plan, son." He smiled. He said something warm and general, and then we went and joined Nora in the greenhouse, and he admired things without knowing what he was looking at and left before dinner. That evening after he and Constance had gone, Nora and I sat on the back porch. She poured 2 glasses of the good Burgundy she had been saving for something and handed one to me and said, "He asked about the property, didn't he?" I said he did. She said, "What did you tell him?" I said, "That there's always been a plan." She smiled. The particular smile that meant she understood something more than she was going to say. She drank her wine. The light was going gold across the field and the tree line was dark against it, and it was the most beautiful piece of land I had ever seen, and it was ours, and we both knew in that moment what we were looking at and what it meant. She said, "Wallace, I want you to call Patricia." Patricia Lund was our estate attorney. We had worked with her since 2008. She was 60 years old, rigorous, and had a way of listening to everything you said before she said anything back that made you feel like the information was being properly received. I said, "What for?" Nora said, "Because I want to make sure that what we built goes where we intend it to go. And I want it done before I can't be part of the decision." I said, "Nora." She said, "Wallace, call Patricia, please." I called Patricia the next morning. We spent 3 weeks in September meeting with Patricia. Nora attended every session. She came in a cardigan with her notebook and her reading glasses, and she asked questions that Patricia later told me, after Nora was gone, were the most precise and structurally sound questions she had encountered from a client in 20 years of estate law. What we built in those 3 weeks was a structure I want to describe carefully because it is the center of everything that follows. We had 3 primary assets. The 14 acres and the house, which the county had most recently assessed at $1.2 million, but which I, as an appraiser of 38 years, knew was worth closer to $1.60 on the current market given the land value, the outbuildings, and the greenhouse. We had an investment portfolio that had been managed conservatively and carefully since 1994. And we had a timber rights agreement on 8 of the 14 acres that generated a modest but consistent quarterly payment from a regional forestry cooperative. Nora had 2 children. Vincent, 44, from Louisville, and our daughter Elaine, 41, who lived in Asheville, North Carolina, where she worked as a licensed clinical social worker and called on Sunday evenings and visited 4 times in those final months and held her mother's hand and planted things in the greenhouse alongside her and did not once ask about the property. Not once. Patricia helped us establish a revocable living trust, the Wallace and Nora Greer Family Land Trust, with me as trustee and Patricia as successor trustee. The 14 acres and the house transferred into the trust. The investment portfolio was restructured with beneficiary designations that bypassed probate entirely. The timber rights agreement was assigned to the trust. We also did something that Patricia said was less common but absolutely permissible and, in the circumstances I had described to her, strongly advisable. We documented intent. Not just the what of the estate plan. The what. A 4-page letter of instruction attached to the trust documents describing, in plain language, the reasoning behind every material decision. Which assets went where and why. Who had contributed to the land and the house and the greenhouse and the life that had been built on those 14 acres. Who had been present. Who had shown up. What presence and love and attention actually looked like over 44 years, from the people who had actually provided it. Nora wrote most of that letter herself, in longhand, in the 3rd week of September when her energy was still sufficient for it. Patricia transcribed and formalized it. It became, once signed and notarized, a legal document of intent attached to the trust. I want you to understand what that letter represented. Because it was not a vindictive document. Nora was not a vindictive person. It was a precise document. The work of a woman who had spent her whole life being precise about what mattered and who was not going to stop being precise at the most important moment. That letter was the beginning of the folder. Nora died on the 14th of October. I'm not going to give you the details of those final days in the way that people sometimes give those details to explain suffering or to earn sympathy. What I will tell you is that she died the way she lived. Precisely. On her own terms. With the people she loved in the room. The 14th of October was a Tuesday. The light that morning came through the bedroom window the way it came through in autumn, low and gold and long across the floor, and she was watching it when she went. I had my hand in hers. Elaine was on the other side of the bed. The greenhouse was visible through the window. The light was on it. That is enough about that. The funeral was the following Saturday. It was well attended. Nora had touched a lot of lives in the particular quiet way of people who do the work without needing the credit, and the people who had been touched by her work showed up. There were people from the Horticultural Society she had helped found in 2006. There were former students from the Landscape Architecture program at the university where she had taught part-time for 11 years. There were neighbors and friends and people I recognized and people I did not. Elaine flew in from Asheville. She handled everything she could handle with the same competent love she had brought to those 4 visits. She arranged flowers from the greenhouse. She wrote the obituary. She stood beside me through everything. Vincent and Constance arrived the morning of the funeral in a car that was newer than I remembered and wearing expressions that were, in Constance's case, appropriate and, in Vincent's case, performing appropriate in a way that I had begun to recognize as distinct from the real thing. The service was held at the church Nora had attended for 30 years. The pastor spoke well. Margot read something Nora had written. Elaine read a passage from a book Nora had loved. I did not speak because I had decided in advance that I was not capable of speaking, and I was right about that. At the graveside after the service, while people were still gathered and the flowers were still being arranged and Margot was crying in the way that means you have lost someone irreplaceable and you know it, Vincent appeared at my elbow. He said, quietly, with the particular tone of someone who has been waiting for an appropriate moment and has decided this is it, "Dad, can I talk to you for a second?" We stepped a few feet away from the group. Not far. Close enough that I could still see Nora's casket. He said, "I know this isn't the time. But Constance and I have been talking and we think it might be time for you to start thinking about downsizing. The property is a lot to manage alone. And we've done some research on some really lovely communities in the area that might be a good fit." He paused. He said, "We just want what's best for you, Dad." I looked at my son for a long moment. Behind him I could see Elaine talking to Margot, her hand on Margot's arm. I could see the roses shaking in the October wind. I could see the casket. I nodded slowly. I said, "I'll think about it, Vincent." He put his hand on my shoulder. He said he knew this was hard and he was there for me and we would talk more soon. Then he went back to Constance. And I stood there at the edge of my wife's grave, and I thought about the folder in my safe at home. Not the folder as it existed that day, because on that day the folder was thin. What I was thinking about was the folder as it was going to exist. Because in that moment, watching the relief spread across my son's face, I made a decision. I was going to finish what Nora had started in September. And I was going to be very, very thorough. If you are watching this right now and you have ever stood at a graveside while someone said something that told you exactly who they were, leave a comment below. I want to know I am not alone in having lived that particular moment. And hit that like button. Because what I am about to tell you is the part that required 11 months of patience and a level of documentation that my appraiser's brain was, it turns out, uniquely suited for. Stay with me. We are just getting started. I called Patricia the Monday after the funeral. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she had been expecting the call. She said, "Wallace, how are you holding up?" I said, "I'm holding." "Patricia, I need to talk to you about something Nora and I started in September that I want to finish." She said, "Tell me." I told her about the graveside conversation. I told her about what Vincent had said. I told her about the relief on his face and the communities he and Constance had researched and the phrase "we want what's best for you" that had the particular texture of a sentence that means something other than what it says. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Wallace, the trust structure is solid. What Nora wanted is documented. But I want to ask you something and I want you to be honest with me." I said, "Always." She said, "Do you believe Vincent is going to accept what the trust provides when the time comes? Or do you believe he is going to challenge it?" I sat with that question in the kitchen of the house that was now very quiet. I said, "Patricia, I have spent 38 years assessing the value of things. I know how to read what something is built on. And what my son is built on right now is an expectation. An expectation of something he believes he is owed. And when that expectation meets the reality of the trust, he is going to do what people do when an expectation is not met. She said, which is? I said, push. She said, then let's make sure there's nothing to push against. That conversation lasted 2 hours. What came out of it was a plan that I want to describe the way I would describe a site assessment. Methodically. In layers. From the foundation up. Layer 1 was documentation. I was a commercial real estate appraiser. Documentation was my native language. I had spent 38 years creating records so complete and so precise that they could withstand challenge in any legal proceeding, and I understood from the inside exactly what kinds of documentation held and what kinds folded. What I began building on the Monday after the funeral was a file. Not a legal file. A factual file. The kind that an appraiser builds when he is documenting the history and condition of a property before establishing its value. I documented every phone call from Vincent over the preceding 18 months. Not from memory. I am a methodical man and I had been keeping a call log since Nora had said what she said on that Sunday afternoon in January. Date, duration, topics discussed, specific language used. The references to the property. The questions about management. The phrase as things progress in August. All of it logged, dated, cross-referenced. I documented Vincent's 2 visits during Nora's illness. What he said. What he asked. What he did not ask. The duration of the visits. What Nora said about those visits afterward, which I had also, because I am who I am, written down in a small notebook I had been keeping since that Sunday in January. I pulled every relevant financial record. Bank statements, investment account records, the timber rights agreement, the property tax history, the insurance records. Not because they were in dispute. Because complete records do not leave room for incomplete narratives. I made a list of every material contribution Nora and I had made to the property and the house since 1991. The renovations. The greenhouse. The land improvements. The fencing. The orchard Nora had planted in 2006 that now produced more fruit than we could use and that she had given away freely to anyone who wanted it. All of it documented with dates and costs and photographs I had been taking since 1991 because I am an appraiser and I take photographs of things the way other people breathe. This documentation became the core of the folder. Patricia reviewed it in our second meeting, 2 weeks after the funeral, and sat back in her chair in a way that suggested she was both impressed and unsurprised. She said, Wallace, you understand that none of this is necessary for the trust to function as written. I said, I understand that. She said, so what is it for? I said, it is for the moment when Vincent sits across from you and says that the trust does not reflect Nora's true wishes, or that she was not of sound mind, or that I had undue influence over the process, or whatever the argument is that he arrives at. When that moment comes, I want to have a document so complete and so precise that there is no room in it for a false narrative. Patricia looked at me. She said, you have done this before. I said, I have assessed properties where the history was disputed. Yes, the principle is the same. You document the truth so thoroughly that the lie has nowhere to stand. She said, all right, Wallace. Let's build it properly. Layer 2 was witnesses. In the weeks following the funeral, I did something that required a particular kind of conversation. I spoke, individually, to 7 people who had been present in meaningful ways during the last year of Nora's life. Margot. 3 members of the Horticultural Society. The architect who had designed the house. Our neighbor Glenn, who had farmed the adjacent land for 30 years and had known us since we moved in. And Dr. Reyes, Nora's oncologist. I did not ask these people for anything dramatic. I did not ask them to sign anything or appear anywhere or make any kind of commitment. I asked each of them a simple question. I asked whether, if they were ever asked, they would be willing to attest to what they had observed about Nora's state of mind, her clarity of intention, and her direct involvement in the estate planning process during the final months of her life. Every single one of them said yes. Margot, who had been Nora's closest friend for 31 years and who had sat with her 3 times a week through the entire illness, said yes before I had finished asking. She said, Wallace, Nora talked to me about that trust. She talked about it clearly and specifically and with complete understanding of what she was doing and why. If anyone tries to say otherwise, I will sit in front of any judge in this state and say what I just said to you. I said, I know, Margot. I know. She said, she was so clear, Wallace. Right up to the end. You know that. I said, I know that. I wrote down every conversation I had with those 7 people. Dated. Summarized. Placed in the folder. Dr. Reyes, to his credit and in a way that I will always be grateful for, offered without being asked to prepare a written statement of clinical assessment regarding Nora's cognitive function during the period of September and October when the trust documents had been prepared. He said he had been a physician for 26 years and he had worked with many patients in end-of-life situations, and Nora Greer was, in his clinical opinion, one of the most lucid and intentional people he had encountered in that context. He said he would be honored to put that in writing. I said, "Thank you, doctor." He said, "She was remarkable. Your wife was remarkable." I said, "She was." I put his written statement in the folder. Layer 3 was the thing I had not initially planned. It came to me 6 weeks after the funeral, on a November evening when I was sitting on the back porch in the cold, because I had always sat on the back porch in the evenings and I was not going to stop because the evenings had become harder. I was sitting there with a glass of wine and Nora's gardening notebook in my lap, not reading it, just holding it, when my phone buzzed with a text message from a number I did not recognize. The text said, "Mr. Greer, my name is Sandra Pauly. I am a realtor in Oldham County. I was given your contact by Vincent Greer regarding the potential listing of your property on Westfield Road. Could we arrange a call?" I sat with that text message for a long time. Then I took a screenshot of it. I printed the screenshot. I added it to the folder with a note on the date and time and the source and the fact that I had not given anyone permission to contact a realtor about my property. I called Patricia the next morning. I said, "Patricia, I need you to hear something." I read her the text message. There was a silence that lasted approximately 5 seconds. Then she said, "Wallace, I want you to forward that text to me immediately. And I want you to call that realtor back and have a very brief conversation in which you tell her that there has been a misunderstanding and the property is not available for listing. I want you to document that conversation as well." I said, "Done." She said, "And Wallace, I want to add a layer to the trust structure that we had not previously discussed. Have you ever heard of an in terrorem clause?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "It is a provision in a trust or will that states if any beneficiary challenges the terms of the document in court, they forfeit any inheritance they would otherwise have received. They are sometimes called no contest clauses. They are enforceable in this state under specific conditions. Given what you have just told me, I believe those conditions are met." I said, "Do it." She said, "I'll have the amendment ready by Friday." I said, "Patricia." She said, "Yes?" I said, "He contacted a realtor about my property. While I am still living in it. While the ink on his mother's grave marker is still drying." She said, "I know, Wallace." I said, "I want this folder to be the most complete document you have ever worked with." She said, "I'll do my part. You keep doing yours." I added the in terrorem clause to the trust on a Friday afternoon. I sat in Patricia's office and signed the amendment and watched her notarize it and place it in the file, and I thought about the text message from Sandra Pauly and what it meant about the kind of son I had raised and the kind of man he had become in the spaces where I had not been watching carefully enough. I drove home. I went to the greenhouse. I stood in it for a long time in the smell of soil and growing things and the particular warmth that Nora had created in a space she had built from salvaged glass and reclaimed timber. Then I went inside and made dinner and sat at the table alone and ate. Vincent called the following Sunday. His usual time. Warm general checking in. He said, "How are you doing, Dad?" "Really?" I said, "Taking it one day at a time, son." He said, "That's all you can do. Listen, I was thinking about what we talked about at the funeral. About the property. I don't want you to feel any pressure, but Constance and I have been doing some research and there are some really interesting options. Some of them even have land management programs so the property could be maintained while you—" I said, "Vincent, I told you I would think about it. I'm thinking about it." He said, Of course, Dad. There's no rush. There's no rush." I thought about Sandra Pauly's text message in my folder. I thought about the amendment Patricia had notarized that Friday. I thought about what no rush sounded like from a man who had already called a realtor. I said, "I appreciate you thinking of me, son." He said, "Always, Dad. That's what family is for." I said, "It is." We talked about the weather and the kids and the drive up for the holidays, and then we hung up and I sat in the kitchen and looked at the notebook in the junk drawer, Nora's notebook, the one I had not been able to move because it belonged exactly where she had put it. I picked it up. I opened it to the last entry she had written, which was in the second week of October, a few days before she went. It said, "The greenhouse needs the east panel recocked before winter. The amaryllis bulbs are in the bottom left drawer. Do not let Wallace forget the amaryllis." I closed the notebook. I went to the greenhouse and recocked the east panel myself. I found the amaryllis bulbs in the bottom left drawer. I planted them correctly. Then I went back to the folder. Months 3 through 7 were the accumulation. I want to tell you what accumulation looks like when you are patient and methodical and you have 38 years of professional discipline and precise documentation. It looks like this. Vincent called a property management company in February and had them drive past the Westfield Road property. I know this because the property management company, not understanding who they were dealing with, sent a follow-up letter to the property address describing their services and referencing a conversation with Vincent Greer. That letter went into the folder. In March, Constance made a social media post, since deleted but not before I had taken a screenshot, describing a property she called Our Future Project and including a photograph that was identifiably taken from the road in front of my house. That screenshot went into the folder. In April, Vincent asked me during a Sunday call whether I had updated my power of attorney documents since Nora passed. He said he would be happy to be designated. I told him I would look into it. I told Patricia about it on Monday. Patricia said, "Do not sign any power of attorney document with Vincent as designee." I said, "Of course not." I already had a durable power of attorney designating Elaine, which Patricia had helped me prepare in November. In May, Vincent visited. He came alone without Constance, which was unusual. He walked the property with me in a way that felt less like a son visiting his father and more like a man taking a final look at something before making an offer. He asked about the timber rights agreement. He asked whether the property had been recently appraised. He said the land values in this area had really appreciated and it would be smart to know what things were worth. I am an appraiser. I know exactly what the land is worth. I said, "I'll look into that too, Vincent." He left before dinner. I stood at the kitchen window and watched his car go down the drive, and I thought about Nora in January of 2022 saying he walks the land in a way that is less like a son who loves where he grew up and more like someone who is calculating. She had been right. She had always been right. I went to the folder. In June, through a contact I will not name who worked at a title company, I became aware that Vincent had made an inquiry about the title status of the Westfield Road property. Not a formal request. An informal one. A conversation. The kind of inquiry a man makes when he wants to know whether a property is held in an individual name or a trust structure, and therefore whether it would be subject to probate proceedings. The inquiry had received no useful information because the property was in the trust and the trust was properly registered and the title status was what Patricia had made it, which was airtight. But the inquiry itself went into the folder. With a date and a source notation and a cross-reference to the timeline of every other thing I had documented. By July, the folder was 2 inches thick. I brought it to Patricia's office in the 3rd week of July and set it on her desk, and she picked it up and held it for a moment the way you hold something when you are weighing it, physically and otherwise. She said, "Wallace, this is extraordinary." I said, "This is what a 38-year appraiser does with 11 months. She said, "Have you told Elaine?" I said, "Not yet." She said, "You need to." I said, "I know. I'm going to do that when the time is right." She said, "When is the time right?" I thought about it. I said, "When the folder is finished." She said, "Is the folder finished?" I thought about the in terrorem clause and the letter of intent and the witness statements and the call logs and Sandra Polly's text message and the social media screenshot and the property management letter and the timber rights inquiry and everything else that was in there. I said, "Almost. There is one more thing I need to do." The last thing I added to the folder was a letter. Not a legal document. Not a record or a log or a statement. A letter. Written in my own hand on the good stationery Nora had kept in the desk drawer for 30 years, the cream paper with the slight texture that she said made writing feel like it meant something. I wrote it over 3 evenings in early August. I wrote it carefully and I revised it twice, and I was precise about every word because precision was what Nora had taught me and what she had embodied and what this document required. The letter was addressed to Vincent. It began, "By the time you read this, you will have met with Patricia Lund and reviewed the terms of the Wallace and Nora Greer Family Land Trust. I want to write to you now while I am still here and while I can still say these things clearly, because I believe some things are better said directly than left to legal documents to imply." I told him about the folder. Not what was in it. Just that it existed and what it represented. I told him that I had spent 38 years assessing the value of things and that I understood the difference between a man who loved something and a man who wanted something, and that there was a document in existence that had been assembled with the same rigor I had brought to every professional assessment of my career, and that the document would speak for itself if it ever needed to. I told him about the in terrorem clause. Plainly. Without softening. I told him about his mother. About the September she had spent making sure that what she and I had built over 44 years would go where she intended it to go. I told him that the trust and the letter of intent and the documentation had been her idea as much as mine. That it had been her precision, her foresight, her insistence on doing it right while she still could. I told him that I loved him. I was clear about that. It was important to be clear about that. And then I told him what I wanted from whatever time we had left. Not the property. Not legal outcomes. I wanted a son who showed up the way Elaine showed up. Who called because he wanted to talk, not because he was gathering information. Who visited because he missed his parents, not because he was calculating the value of their land. I told him that was the only inheritance that had ever actually mattered to me. I folded the letter. I sealed it in an envelope. I wrote his name on the outside. I put it in the folder. Then I closed the folder and I put it back in the safe. And I called Elaine. Elaine picked up on the first ring. She said, "Dad, is everything okay?" I said, "Everything is okay. I have something to tell you and I want to do it properly." She said, "I'm listening." I told her everything. From Nora's observation in January 2022 to the graveside conversation to Patricia and the trust amendment to the folder. All of it. In order. The way I would walk a client through a property assessment, one element at a time so that the whole picture assembled clearly by the time you finished. She was quiet for a long time when I stopped. Then she said, "Dad, the realtor." I said, "Yes." She said, "He called a realtor. About your house." While Mom was. I said, "Yes." Another silence. She said, "You have all of this documented." I said, "Every bit of it." She said, "And the trust." I said, "Is airtight." Nora made sure of that. She said, "Mom made sure of that." I said, "She was very clear about what she wanted." Elaine cried then. Not the crying of someone learning bad news. The crying of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has just been told that the person who should have been protecting the thing was already protecting it. She said, "I'm coming up." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm coming up this weekend." I said, "I know, Elaine." She came that Friday. She came the way she always came, with groceries and without ceremony, and we sat in the kitchen on Friday evening and I put the folder on the table between us. She opened it. I watched her read. She read for 40 minutes without saying a word. She read with the same precision her mother had brought to everything, going through every page, every log entry, every screenshot, every letter, every witness statement, Dr. Reyes's clinical notation, the interim amendment, Nora's handwritten letter of intent. When she finished, she closed the folder and put her hands flat on the cover and looked at me. She said, "Dad, this is remarkable." I said, "It is what it needed to be." She said, "What are you going to do with it?" I said, "I'm going to invite Vincent here. In September. For a formal meeting with Patricia. And I'm going to put the folder on the table the same way I just put it in front of you." She said, "And if he pushes back?" I said, "He won't. Because he's going to understand, the moment he sees what's in that folder, that there is nothing left to push against. The structure is complete. The documentation is complete. Nora's intentions are documented in her own handwriting. 7 witnesses are prepared to attest to her clarity and intent. A no-contest clause removes any incentive to challenge legally. And the letter explains everything that the legal documents don't say. Elaine looked at the folder. She said, "Mom planned this with you, didn't she?" I said, "She started it." Elaine nodded. She put her hand on top of mine on the folder. She said, "She would have been so pleased with you." I said, "She would have told me I missed something." Elaine laughed. The Real laugh, the involuntary one, the one she had gotten from Nora. The best sound I had heard in 11 months. She said she would have. And then she would have been pleased. September came. Patricia arranged the meeting at her office. Neutral ground. Her choice, which I agreed with because she had done this before and I trusted her, read on the staging. Vincent came alone. He came in the professional manner he had when he knew a meeting was structured, which meant he had expected something and had prepared himself for it, which told me he had been watching the situation closely enough to feel the shift in the ground under his feet even if he could not identify its source. He shook my hand. He shook Patricia's hand. He sat down. Patricia opened her copy of the trust documents. She walked him through the structure clearly and without editorializing. The trust. The assets. The beneficiary designations. Elaine as residential beneficiary. The timber rights remaining in trust with distributions allocated by Patricia's discretion to maintain the property. Vincent listened with the professional composure of a man who was controlling his reaction carefully. I watched his face do the particular arithmetic of someone adding up numbers that are not landing where expected. When Patricia finished the structural overview, she said, "There is one additional provision I want to walk you through specifically." She described the interim clause. She described it plainly and completely. She explained that any legal challenge to the trust's terms would result in the automatic forfeiture of any benefit Vincent would otherwise receive, and that this provision had been prepared, executed, and notarized with full legal compliance. Vincent said, "When was that added?" Patricia said, "The amendment was executed in November." He said, "A month after Mom died." Patricia said, "That is correct." He was quiet. I watched him reassemble the timeline. Walk it backward. Try to locate the moment the ground had shifted under him and when he had failed to feel it. He said, Dad, did you know I had spoken to someone about the property? I said, I knew. He said, how? I said, because I was paying attention. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the table. Patricia said, Vincent, there is one more element of the estate plan I want you to be aware of. She reached into the folder she had brought, which was a copy of mine, and she placed Nora's letter of intent on the table. She said, This is a letter of instruction executed by your mother in September of last year as part of the trust documentation. It is a legal attachment to the trust. I would like you to read it. He picked it up. He read it. I watched him read his mother's handwriting. The careful, precise, unambiguous handwriting of a woman who had never in her life been approximate about anything she meant. He read it twice. Then he set it down and he looked at me and his face was the face of a man who has just understood something that he cannot ununderstand. The kind of understanding that comes when you stop looking at what something appears to be and you finally see what it is built on. He said, she wrote this. I said, she wrote it herself. He said, she knew. I said, she always knew, Vincent. That was your mother. He looked at the table for a long time. Then I reached into my briefcase and I placed my copy of the folder on the table between us. I said, this is documentation I have been building since the month after your mother passed. It is a complete record of events, conversations, actions, and statements relevant to the estate. It includes communications that I want to be transparent with you about because I believe you deserve transparency even when the contents of the record are uncomfortable. He did not open it. He looked at it. He looked at the thickness of it. The 2 inches of careful, dated, cross-referenced truth sitting on Patricia's conference table. He said, Dad. I said, I'm going to ask you to take that home and read it before we speak again. I'm going to ask you to read it the way your mother would have read anything. Completely. Precisely. Without looking for the argument and without defending yourself to yourself while you're reading. Just read it. He nodded. Very slowly. I said, and then I want you to read the letter I wrote you. It's at the back. He looked up. I said, it is not a legal document, Vincent. It is from your father. And it says what I needed to say to you directly rather than leaving it to everything else in that folder to imply. He picked up the folder. He held it for a moment. Then he said, can I ask you something? I said, yes. He said, did Mom ask you to do all of this? I thought about January 2022. About the pot she was repotting and the Sunday quiet and the way she had set it down and looked at me and said what she said with the steadiness she always had when she had been considering something for a long time. I thought about September in Patricia's office. Nora with her notebook and her glasses, asking questions that Patricia said were the most precise she had encountered in 20 years. I thought about the evening she had poured the good burgundy and said, Wallace, I want you to call Patricia. I said she started it. I finished it. He said, okay. He stood up. He shook Patricia's hand. He looked at me. He said, I'll call you after I read it. I said, take your time. He left. Patricia and I sat in the quiet of her office for a moment. Outside the window the September light was doing the same long gold thing it did in October, and it made me think of the greenhouse and the back porch and the wine in the field. Patricia said, that went as well as it could have gone. I said, he's not a bad person. He made bad calculations. She said, most people do in situations like this. I said, his mother would have said the same thing. Patricia smiled. She said she would have. And then she would have been precise about it. I said, yes, she would have. Vincent called 3 weeks later. He called on a Sunday. His usual time. But the tone was different from the first word. Stripped of the professional warmth. Just his voice. The real one. He said, Dad. I read the folder. I said, okay. He said, all of it. I said, I know. A silence. He said, the realtor. I want to explain about the realtor. I said, you don't have to explain, Vincent. He said, I do. I want to. It wasn't, I know what it looks like. I know what the record looks like. But I need you to hear me say that it was not about wanting to take anything from you. It was about, I had told myself a story about what was practical and what was best, and I had told that story so many times that I stopped examining it. I said, I know how that happens. He said, the letter. He stopped. That. The letter at the back of the folder. I said, yes. He said, I read it 4 times. I waited. He said, you said you wanted a son who showed up the way Elaine showed up. I said, I did. He said, I want to try to be that. I don't know if I can undo what I've already been, but I want to try. I sat in the kitchen. The morning light was on the countertop. The amaryllis Nora had planted were growing in the greenhouse. The bird feeder she had kept stocked for 15 years was full because I had made it a point to keep it full. I said, "That's enough, Vincent. That's enough to start with." He said, "I'm sorry, Dad. For what it's worth, for everything I did. I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are." He said, "Can I come up? Just to visit. Not to just to see you." I said, "Yes. Come for the weekend. Elaine's going to be here next month. Come when Elaine's here." He said, "Okay. Yeah. Okay, Dad." He came in October. He and Elaine and I sat on the back porch the way Nora and I used to sit, and the light went gold across the field, and nobody talked about the property or the trust or the folder. We talked about other things. About the kids and about Nashville and about a book Elaine was reading and about a project I had taken on with the Horticultural Society to help Margot continue some of what Nora had started. At some point Vincent stood up and walked to the edge of the porch and looked at the greenhouse. He stood there for a while. Then he said, "She really built that herself?" I said, "Every panel." He said, "I didn't know that." I said, "You never asked." He said, "No, I didn't." He came back and sat down. We stayed on the porch until the light was gone. Before I tell you what comes next, I want to speak to you directly for a moment. If you have ever built something, a life, a home, a marriage, a business, a garden, anything built with time and intention and the daily work of showing up, and you have felt someone trying to claim a portion of that work before it is finished, this story is for you. Share it right now. With one person who needs to hear that patience is not the same as surrender. That documentation is not the same as revenge. That the quiet work of protecting what matters is as important as the work of building it in the first place. And subscribe if you are not already here. Because every week on this channel there is someone who built something and protected it, and we tell that story the way it deserves to be told. The property is still mine. The trust is still in place. Patricia is still the successor trustee. Elaine is still the residential beneficiary, which is what Nora wanted, which is what the letter of intent says, which is what every piece of documentation supports with a completeness that I will match against any challenge any attorney in this state wants to bring. No challenge has come. The in terrorem clause has never needed to be invoked. Margot comes out on Tuesdays. We sit in the greenhouse and she tells me things about the plants that Nora told her that Nora never thought to tell me, and I write them in the notebook system and try to follow the indexing. I'm not as good at it as Nora was. No one is. The amaryllis came up in February exactly where Nora had planted them. I stood in the greenhouse and looked at them for a long time when they bloomed. I thought about the bottom left drawer and the note in the notebook and the fact that she had thought to write it down. She always thought to write it down. Vincent visited twice this year. The first visit he came alone. The second he brought Constance and the kids. The kids ran the property the way kids run land that feels like it was made for running on. I watched them from the back porch and thought about Nora and the roses along the south fence line and what she would have said about grandchildren in a garden she had spent 20 years building. She would have been pleased. She would have corrected their names for the plants and then been pleased. The folder is still in the safe. It will stay there until I decide otherwise. But I think about something Nora said on the last evening we sat on the back porch together before she became too sick to sit on the porch. We had the wine and the light was going gold, and she was looking at the greenhouse with the expression she had when she was thinking about something she was not going to rush into words. She said, "Wallace, you know what this all is, don't you?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "It is evidence. All of it. The land and the house and the greenhouse and the garden and all of it. It is evidence of what two people can build when they decide that the work is worth doing." I said, "Evidence of what?" She said, "That it was real. That it happened. That we were here." I said, "Yes, Nora." She said, "Make sure it stays that way." I said, "I will." I meant it. The land is evidence. The folder is evidence. The 14 acres and the greenhouse built from salvaged glass and the roses along the south fence and the amaryllis in the bottom left drawer and Nora's notebook in the kitchen junk drawer and the bird feeder she kept stocked for 15 years, all of it is evidence. That we were here. That it was real. That it happened. And I protected it. That is the only inheritance that matters. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment below. Tell me about something you built that was worth protecting. Hit that like button. Subscribe so you never miss a story. I will see you in the next one.